We will long remember the beginning of January 1940. The heaviest snowfalls had begun, and snow lay literally everywhere. It covered the runways and piled up the hangar doors. It piled into the cockpits of airplanes and made our lives almost unbearable. The road to Lincoln was closed for a whole week. The mess hall ran out of beer. At our request, a Wellesley long-range bomber flew in and dropped a few cases by parachute, but the boys quickly drank it all. One evening, we decided to go to a movie in Lincoln with Mull. Through an impenetrable blizzard, we rolled down the highway in my car. It was impossible to make out anything behind the windshield. Mull had to walk beside the car, holding a flashlight in his hand while I sat behind the wheel. We were barely crawling. Quite suddenly, we found ourselves in front of the base gate again. In the darkness and blizzard, we managed to lose our way somewhere, described a circle, and returned to the place we left from. We never made it to the movies that evening. A couple of officers who had fought in the last war said that in such bad weather the only thing we could do was to gather around the piano and sing in chorus. Since we didn't have any ideas of our own anyway, we decided to give it a try. So we all got together, Jackie Withers drumming on the keys, and the guys sitting around with mugs of beer in their hands. I had orange juice, though, and we sang along, tearing our throats out. A lot of songs were sung, some good, some bad. One night, Oscar burst into the dining room laughing. It was so unlike Oscar to laugh at the top of his lungs that we asked him if he felt bad. He squeezed out with difficulty. "Go to the billiard room and see for yourself." We rushed there, and indeed what I saw nearly made me collapse on the floor. Around the piano sat 3 priests with mugs of beer, looking extremely serious. They were chanting, "Next one to fly off." As usual in the army, any unit that is not in the line of fire quickly becomes a red rag for higher commanders who want to change things. Just like that, now came the order to turn our squadron into a flight school. Every morning we had to listen to 3-hour lectures. We had already begun to call ourselves the 83rd Combat Training Unit. These were lectures on navigating, on armament, on meteorology, in short, everything that we had known for a long time. Every morning at 8:30 a drill was held. There were arranged verification of personnel so that the commanders of the links could make sure that everything was in place. Life became a nightmare. It was brightened only by 2-day leave. During this time I managed to get to Sheffield to see Eva, who was performing there with her troupe. At the end of January, the snow began to melt and rivers of water flowed over the airfield. The women's auxiliary barracks flooded, which gave rise to several conflicting rumours. Both squadrons were to move north to Kilnos and Lossiemouth to hunt for German submarines and, if necessary, to strike German ships. Finally, these rumours became fact and preparations for relocation began. I arranged with Willie Sny that my airplane will ferry Jackie Withers. I took the train to Glasgow and managed to pay another visit to Eva as her troop had moved there. It was an eerie trip. Most people who have had the misfortune to travel overnight in wartime third class won't brag about it. The trains were always late, so I had to spend the night in Perth on the way to Lossiemouth. Finally, I got to Lossiemouth. The guys met me at the local golf club and told me that the flight went fine, except that all the planes were out of commission because the wet snow and ice packed into the flap slots had put them out of commission, and now the planes were being repaired. It was several days before both squadrons regained combat capability. Life at Lossiemouth was very pleasant. A branch of the Gulf Stream ran in Moray Firth Bay, and so even in February it was quite warm. We spent day after day walking along the beaches, gawking at the fishermen and fresh fish vendors. Sometimes we managed to fly a little. The base commander and the chief of staff sometimes joined us. Why, I don't know. Maybe they wanted to shoot a little too. As usual, there were rumours about where we'd be sent. But the most common rumour was that we'd be stuck here for a long time. The prospect was not a bad one, as Scotland was a very pretty place. Day after day, we practised flying as a whole squadron and finally made some progress. But we hardly escaped a few serious accidents. One day we were practising a low run-up takeoff and Willie Snife advised us to let the flaps out until they failed. That meant letting the flaps out 30 degrees, the normal mode on takeoff. But old man Pitzarnhill, who was flying my formation, took him literally and released the flaps all the way down. As a result, his plane with great difficulty gained speed and rose into the air, skipping over the very fence of the base. I tried to stay as close as possible to my anchor and did not have time to get off the ground at all. The wheels of my plane caught the fence and we almost hit the ground. But the pinnacle of all was the anti-submarine patrol, when Sam Tripleton commanded the group. It was a botched operation, and no one in particular can be blamed. It will remain a black page in the squadron's annals. We were on duty in the recreation room when the order came to take off and head for the coast of Norway, as there is detected a German ocean submarine returning from a trip to the Atlantic. We were ordered not to bomb any other boats, as there could be British submarines hunting for the Nazis nearby. Taking special bombs, we took off. A few hours later, Sam's plane fired a flare, and we realized he had spotted someone. Almost immediately, Jackie Withers shouted, "There it is! There it is! There's a submarine, a German submarine, of course." Immediately, all the planes opened their bomb flaps and rushed to attack. We all amicably missed. The bombs fell into the water a few feet from the side of the boat, which hastily submerged. Then we resumed patrolling. A little later we spotted another boat, but we tried to avoid it. After all, we had orders not to attack other submarines because they might have been British. Then we returned to the base. The Admiral was already waiting for us there. As soon as we landed, he came at us with a scolding. It turned out that we had attacked His Majesty's submarine, and its crew had been saved only because we had not aimed well. Then Sam blushed, and it came to us that the second boat we had seen, which we had carefully avoided, was an enemy boat. Such accidents are inevitable in war, and we had only to thank God that we had not drowned our comrades. In Lossiemouth we were invited to parties more than once, and the locals were not stingy with Scotch whisky. However, we had more than enough to do. More than once we took off to patrol the North Sea, but after a few hours in the air we returned without finding anything. I had never seen such a desolate sea in my life. However, we were grateful to fate at least for the fact that the weather held good. Fortunately, before we were bored with these fruitless sorties, the order came to return to Scampton. We were all terribly glad when the wheels of our planes touched good old Scampton dirt on March 19, 1940. When we looked into Saracan Head that evening, it was unusually empty. We didn't realize it at first, but then we learned the reason. The next day, the newspapers reported that several squadrons of Hamptons had flown to Zilt in retaliation for the German air raids on Scapa Flow and Firth of Forth. Our operation was unsuccessful. The Germans claimed to have suffered no casualties at all. They even invited American journalists to see for themselves, but did not show them the Northern Seaplane base at Hornham, on which most of the bombs were dropped. One of our pilots mistakenly dropped bombs on the Danish island of Bornholm, but it was an understandable mistake. Our planes were bombing from an altitude of 2,000 feet, and the searchlights of Hornham, only 2 miles away, blinded the pilot. Most of the pilots involved in this raid had never been on a real combat mission before. Reading their reports proved to be very entertaining. They found the anti-aircraft fire very interesting and amusing, the searchlight beams elegant, and in general everything was well, except that no one hit the target. The next week we started night training flights again. We had to fly over the snowy fields of England at an altitude of 2,000 feet, using maps. Sometimes we were off course, but with each new flight we felt more and more confident. It was beginning to seem to us that the command would now use the Hamptons only for night raids. During the day they were too defenceless. At this time the Germans began to use against England a new secret weapon: magnetic mines. At first, everyone wondered how they managed to put these mines so close to our ports and river mouths. The fleet well guarded all approaches to the island and did not let even fast boats. It was therefore decided that the mines would be placed by seaplanes. Most seaplanes took off from bases between Sylt and Borkum on the northwest coast of Germany. Therefore, the head of Bomber Command gave a secret order. Our bombers were to patrol between these islands at night and drop bombs on any light track on the water to prevent the minesweeper planes from taking off and landing. Oddly enough, these flights were quite successful. We even managed to disrupt the seaplanes' mine-laying activities. But then they began to use for this purpose modernized Ne-111. These bombers took off from airfields in Germany, so in the first days we could not do anything with them. We had recently gained serious experience in night flying, and so we began to be sent to conduct reconnaissance over German territory. I myself have never participated in a leaflet dispersal operation, but many of our pilots were lucky. I say lucky without a trace of irony. The first flight over enemy territory is always going to be a nerve-wracking experience, and leaflet dropping is a good job to calm down a bit and get used to it. But there will always be someone who will claim that these flights were completely useless. Meanwhile, Sam Tripleton had left the squadron. We were very sorry about this, as the cheerful Yorkshireman was remembered for his sense of humour. However, Major Dennis Field, who replaced him, was every bit as good. He immediately endeavoured to pull up his link to get ahead of us. It was the beginning of spring. The squadron was perfectly prepared and fully manned with crews. Apparently, the war was going to gallop, but for the time being we could only sit and wait. We were grateful for this respite, for on September 3 we were totally unprepared. Now the situation had changed. We learned to fly at night. Our navigators worked almost without error. We learned to put bombs in a half-mile radius circle from 12,000 feet. We even learned how to land an airplane on its belly. Yes, the respite came in handy, and we made the best use of it. The spring days were flying away, and we watched with pride as flowers sprouted and bloomed in our garden. We knew we didn't have long to wait, but we were ready. The morning of April 9 was cold and clear. I'd woken up very early and was now lying in a warm and cosy bed. I listened to Bruce snoring in the next bunk and felt sorry for the girl who would marry him. I tried to look at my watch, but it was still too dark. I swore, remembering that we'd forgotten to raise the gas mask curtain last night. I had no idea what time it was, so I decided to try to go back to sleep. Suddenly the door slammed and my resident Crosby appeared. In his shaky hand, teacups clinked. "Good morning, sir. It's a marvellous day. Hitler has struck again. He's getting into Norway." I bulleted out of bed and shook Bruce. "They've done it, Bruce. Get up, you old slacker," I shouted. But Bruce was sleeping too soundly, and it took him a while to wake up. At last he got up too, and we began to pack. Half an hour later we had breakfast and showed up at Oscar's place right in the flight control center. What we wondering began. What would we have to do? Oscar, as usual, thought it was all a duck. "I don't see how he can get in there." He seemed to be talking to himself, not to the airmen gathered in the room. The Navy has always said it will sink any ship that comes out of Skagerrak, either with its submarines or ships. I don't understand what Hitler is counting on, getting into a fight with a much stronger navy. What do they have anyway? There's a Scharnhorst stuck in a floating dock in Kiel, as well as several light cruisers. The Gneisenau and a pocket battleship are in Hamburg. They don't stand a chance. I'm afraid I was completely ignorant of this. German torpedo boats came to my mind for some reason. I'd attack France first, someone said. So would I. We were all puzzled. But then the phone rang. It was Willie. We all immediately crowded around us. "Yes, sir." "Okay, sir. We're all ready, sir." "How many, sir?" "I'm taking off." When he hung up, everyone spoke at once. "Good news, Eagles." "Take me, Oscar." "You have to include me." "How many men do you need?" "You want the best crew." "Then I'm ready." "Shut up, all of you old asses," shouted Oscar. "If anyone's going to fly, it's myself, also Gibbo and Rossi. Ian, you stay on the phone. I need to see the commander." To say that everyone was happy with the decision would be a shameless lie. For months we'd just been idling. For months we'd been waiting to get started. We've waited so long that we've already started to get rusty. So it was only natural that the opportunity to participate in a combat operation was the most welcome prospect for us. We were in a very different mood than we had been during the September jitters. We had to wait 2 more days, and then we went to see the general. Since we had practiced night flying more than any other squadron, we were chosen along with the 49th Squadron for a special assignment. We were to place our magnetic mines in German coastal waters. Our scientists were not idle during this long winter. They developed a special mine weighing about 1,700 pounds that couldn't be etched. It was dubbed the potato, and we were to plant this vegetable at the most important points in Kattegat and Skagerrak. The plan was simple and, as time showed, successful. Germany was trying to invade the Scandinavian countries by sea. The ships and vessels assembled for this purpose were extremely difficult to attack. They moved only at night, and our fleet had no access to the Baltic. Although the port of Kiel was packed with tanks, guns and soldiers, we did not bomb it so as not to harm the civilian population. When crossing from Kiel to Oslo, already captured by the Germans, these ships had to choose one of 3 perfectly known fairways. The middle one passed through the Great Belt, the eastern one between Copenhagen and Mael, and the western one in the narrows and shallows of the Little Belt. We had to mine these fairways as thickly as possible. In this case, the following could be accomplished. 1. To sink a large ship and thus block the fairway. 2. Damage a large number of ships, which would force the Germans to return. 3. Drown several thousand German soldiers. These mines contained a fair amount of explosives, and therefore could be dropped at considerable depths. Even if the ship was some distance from the mine, the force of the explosion was such that it was literally thrown out of the water. In England was already formed an expeditionary corps to send to Norway. Our mines were to prevent German reinforcements from reaching southern Norway. It would be our contribution to winning the Norwegian War. Everyone was literally beaming with optimism. The newspapers were full of boastful articles written by rearguard soldiers. Politicians made very bold statements, claiming that Hitler had lost his nerve. In America, they began to say that the fox is out of the hole, and now they can catch it. I'm not blaming anyone because we thought exactly the same thing. After all, we were a nation of sailors, and the enemy challenged our sea power. Someone dared to crawl out to sea, right under the noses of the Royal Navy. He was beginning to doze off, but he wasn't asleep forever. And now he had to show the cheeky man who really ruled the seas. So in the pubs of London, the enemy had already been defeated. Countless glasses were drunk to Hitler's biggest mistake. On the London Stock Exchange, stocks went up sharply. On April 11, at about 7 o'clock, we took to the air. The orders were very simple. We are to place mines in the middle fairway at a specified point. Then we were to fly over Kiel to find out how many ships were in port. It was also necessary to examine the small belt and clarify the intensity of traffic through the strait in Middelfart. After that, we could return home. Under no circumstances were we to allow our mines to fall into enemy hands. It was a top-secret weapon, and we could not let him find out about it. If we could not reach the specified point, we should either go back with the mines or drop them in the open sea. In case the airplane crashed over land, we were to abandon it immediately so that the machine would crash into the ground and explode on its own mines. As we took off, I thought about all this. We were terribly glad to be going to war at last, but at the same time we feared that the engine might fail over land. Then we would have to jump over enemy territory, which meant inevitable long captivity. The journey itself went absolutely smoothly. We went out to the designated point and watched the mines fall into the black, bubbling water. Then we visited Kiel, keeping at a safe altitude. It turned out, however, that low clouds covered the harbour, and we could see decidedly nothing. Then we turned toward Middelfart and found that the railroad station was bustling with life, and we wished we had a couple of bombs. As we circled over the town, we saw that the most visible landmark for miles around was the bridge, a fine steel structure reminiscent of the bridge over the Firth of Forth, though not as large. We also noticed that the shores of the strait were covered with ice, even though it was already April, so we could assume that it was quite cold on the ground. After spending 8 hours in the air, we returned home. At Hampton, the pilot can't get up from his seat, so my whole body got stiff during the 8-hour flight. Spending 8 hours sitting down is very hard. But the worst is ahead of you, when at the 9th hour you start to straighten up. That raises another interesting question. I usually answer it with, we don't. But when necessary, you have to use beer bottles or flare casings. Sometimes a long rubber tube is used, the end of which is threaded through a hole in the belly of the airplane. Incidentally, technicians who dislike their pilot tend to tie it in a knot with dreadful consequences. But I will repeat that to the overly curious I always answered, no, we do not. 2 days later, there was a commotion at the base. A report came in that 4 ships full of soldiers had sunk just at the spot we had planted our vegetables. We were completely satisfied, and the other pilots did not hide their joy. Our weapons had worked. On April 14, we received orders to place mines near Middelfart. A big operation was planned, in which about 40 bombers were to take part. In the meantime, the weather had deteriorated, so a meteorologist was called in. He explained that a warm front was moving west towards England at 15 mph, bringing clouds and rain with it. When we would take off, it would be 100 miles offshore, which meant we would have to land wherever we could after returning. At first we flew by compass only, and when the clouds cleared a little, the coast of Denmark appeared ahead. Jackie Withers was quick enough to locate the southern tip of the island of Sylt. Then we set course for the straits. As we flew over Denmark at an altitude of 2,000 feet, we hit low clouds. Although we tried to stay above the cloud layer, its lower boundary had to be quite close to the ground. "Are you sure you saw Sylt?" I asked Jackie. It was definitely a Sylt. I've seen seaplanes. Okay, I'll trust that we're going strictly on schedule. Let me know 3 minutes before you have to start the descent. A little later, Jack told me it was safe to go slowly down. The old Hampton went down smoothly at about 300 fpm and was quickly in the darkness. Jack monotonously reported the altimeter reading. 900 feet, 500 feet. Then there was a strange silence for a while, although we continued to glide downward. Black swirls flashed behind the cockpit windows, and the dashboard glowed faintly. It was getting darker and darker. I looked at my altimeter. The hand was trembling near 0. "Check the altitude, Jack," I said, pressing the intercom button. Then a quiet scolding sounded, and Jack said, "My bad, my wire popped out of its socket." Good Lord, my altimeter says we're about to turn into a submarine. I quickly levelled the airplane. Then I saw the bridge. It was, of course, the Middelfart Bridge, and it appeared right in front of me. It was impossible to make a mistake. If we went higher, we would be in the clouds again and lose our place, so I stayed below. I think Mac, who was sitting in the gunner's seat behind the overhead machine gun, was greatly surprised when he saw the bridge flying above him. I think. The hatch flaps are open. We're in position. Okay, combat course. Steady, steady, not so fast. Okay, mines. Dropped. There was a popping and clinking sound as the mines flew down, and immediately the anti-aircraft guns opened fire on us. Although we were flying at an altitude of only 100 feet, we were soon caught in a cloud. Suddenly Taunton, who was sitting at the bottom machine gun, opened fire as if he had spotted an enemy air defense ship. I don't blame him. He was flying with us as a passenger and decided to work off the money he'd gotten. At that time, airplane crews did not include non-commissioned and warrant officers. Radiators were privates first class, gunners, privates second class, recruited from the personnel of the ground services. For them, an extra 6p per flight was a huge amount. Most of the gunners, like Taunton, had never learned to use machine guns, but in their spare time they tried to help the squadron as much as they could. Soon we were on our way home. I shall never forget that trip. It rained constantly and it was very dark. Every now and then the airplane would start sparking, having picked up static electricity. It reminded me of a cheap circus ride. We were ordered to land at Manston, and now we had to fly straight into a southwest storm. Our speed relative to the ground did not exceed 100 mph. After 2 hours, the lighthouses on the coast of Holland showed below us. Manston was to be expected for at least another 2 hours. Many pilots were flying solely on instruments, and at times they had a strange feeling. They suspected that the instruments were lying, and therefore the airplane could turn upside down at any moment. I was no exception in this respect. I had to shake my head constantly to get rid of the obsession that I was flying upside down. Soon we received a tentative signal from Manston indicating our course. And then suddenly there was a green flash in the low clouds, then another. It was the airfield ordering us to land. We did not waste time. The flight lasted 9 hours, most of the time blind. So it's no wonder I didn't wake up until 4 o'clock the next day. Silvo didn't come back. He got the signal from the airfield, but skipped across the channel to the Atlantic. We never saw him again. In 49 Squadron, 2 crews didn't return. Both pilots were married. I felt sorry for the poor squadron adjutant who had to break the news to the widows. Air Major Lowe went astray and crashed near Newcastle. His gunner was killed. The whole night was a nightmare. Of all the airplanes that went up, Jack and I were the only ones who put the mines where they should have been. Naturally, we were awfully proud of ourselves and had a little party the night after we got back. Brainless idiots. If we flew at night, the other squadrons did their business during the day. Hampton's 5th Group made long-range sorties to the coast of Norway, looking for German ships, usually cruisers, which were stationed in the fjords. Once 2 squadrons were on duty all day, preparing to attack the cruiser Leipzig, which was stationed near Hilversum. 3 times the order to take off came, and 3 times it was cancelled. I don't know who gave these orders, probably someone in the Admiralty, but this man acted like a child. They were ordered to take off. As soon as the planes were in the air, a red flare flew from the signal tower and the planes had to land. If their lordships had heard what the pilots were saying at this time, they would have just drowned themselves. Finally, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the final order came. When the planes reached the coast of Norway, it was already dark in the fjords. Fog had lifted and visibility had deteriorated sharply. After a fruitless search, the frustrated pilots turned. Their lordships were furious. But Group Commander Air Vice Marshal Harris remembered Napoleon's words: order, counter-order, chaos. When at last the Hamptons were given their chance and found themselves over Norway in the afternoon, a bloody skirmish ensued. The pilots had orders to stay in close formation so that if fighters appeared, they could meet them with concentrated fire from all machine guns, but the Germans were no fools. They found a vulnerable place Hamptonoffs, as machine gun points had dead zones, so the Germans attacked from there. A squadron from Edinburgh, commanded by Major Watte, encountered the enemy near Stavanger. Far out to sea could see a few clouds in which to take cover, but they were too far away. Watte immediately ordered the squadron to close in and dive down to the water itself. If he'd been a fool and ordered them to gain altitude to hide in the clouds, the Germans would have outnumbered them one by one. However, our pilots met with Me-100 fighters, which had a single machine gun capable of firing sideways. They chose a specific method of attack. The Germans flew parallel to the group of Hampton at a distance of about 50 yards just ahead of the British. The gunner of the German aircraft calmly aimed his machine gun at the cockpit of the outermost Hampton and opened fire. There was nothing the bomber pilots could do about it. All that was left was to hold formation and wait to be shot down. If they tried to break away from the formation, they would immediately be hit by the 3 Me-109s that were on duty above. If they stayed put, the pilot would sooner or later get a machine gun line right in the face. One by one, the outermost planes fell into the sea. Watte saw this terrible carnage. The airplane was engulfed in flames, and then the wing would cling to the lead grey water. First W. Beer, then R. Peter. Who's next? Now it's N. Harry on the edge. The German gunner carefully aims his machine gun, and soon N. Harry disappears into the waves. Next up was Old Man S. Charlie. One pilot made a futile gesture, trying to cheat fate in some way. He opened the cockpit window and started firing his revolver at the enemy fighter. But it was of no avail, and this brave act was the last of his life. Finally, the squadron reached a low cloud, and 4 airplanes out of 12 managed to return home. Poor old Watte. A couple weeks later, while returning from a raid on Hamburg, he snagged an aerostate cable near Harwich and crashed into a grain elevator building. His funeral pyre burned for 2 days. But despite bad luck and losses, some squadrons were successful in Norway. For example, Bud Malloy managed to hit a cruiser from 10,000 feet with a 500-pound bomb. The cruiser burst into flames and intelligence later reported that it sank. I believe this was the first time in the history of the Royal Air Force that a warship was sunk from 10,000 feet. I could write a lot about the bravery shown during these early operations. So many fine experienced pilots met their end off the bleak shores of Norway. But the lessons for which they had to pay so dearly proved very useful to the survivors. Meanwhile, things in Norway were getting worse and worse. Our troops in the north were being raided almost continuously by dive bombers. This made getting supplies by sea almost impossible. Of course, we had a few gladiators there, which operated from the frozen lake, but in general faced such difficulties that we could not overcome. Still, a handful of experienced pilots fought to the end, to the last airplane. Even when a few Hurricanes were flown on the aircraft carrier Gloriez to try to hold off the Krauts, it was to no avail. The Germans had a complete and undeniable air superiority, and there was nothing that could be done about it. I could write a lot about these men who fought in the north, but that is not my job. My book is devoted to the actions of bomber aviation. On April 19, it became clear that it was not Hitler, but someone else. If he missed his bus at sea, he had time to buy a return ticket for the flying bus. All day long, Ju-52 transport planes transferred soldiers and equipment to southern Norway from Danish airfields. Sometimes up to 200 transport planes could be seen at one airfield at once. One of these airfields was Aalborg, which looked like a pretty vulnerable target. Oscar, Rossi and I were chosen to conduct the first bombing raid of the war. It must be said that this was the first time at all that British bombers were sent to attack an enemy airfield. There was still some doubt about the choice of bombs. Some said they should take lighters. Others agitated for 500-pounders. Finally, we chose 30 and 40-pounders, one 250-pounder, and some incendiaries. We were to attack at dawn, dropping bombs from 1,000 feet, aiming at the planes lined up on the ground, and try to destroy as many machines as possible. I asked myself why so few planes were allocated to the attack. Why not the whole squadron? We had the planes. We could have done much better, but I believe that the command was trying hard to avoid losses. The Royal Air Force was still 2 years away from the spectre of losses, and as a result we only scratched the targets a little, unable to destroy them. No one knew why this was happening. However, we had to follow the orders given by others. On the evening of April 19, we had a small get-together in the mess hall. I remember sitting next to Rossi, sipping lemonade, and we waited for everyone else to gather. I was very excited when Oscar showed up, lit his pipe and said, "Come on, let's have a little snack. We have to take off at 2-minute intervals. Takeoff is at 1 o'clock in the morning." At 10 to 1 o'clock, I climbed into the cockpit of US Charlie. The night was just nasty. It was raining like a bucket and the clouds were coming in at about 300 feet. When we turned on the intercom, there was only a noxious hissing sound in the headphones. The rain had soaked the wiring and the intercom system was out of order. I cursed Mac, who was desperately trying to get it working. Oscar's plane took off with a roar, followed by Ross's. Mac tried his best, but the water wouldn't give up either. Finally, we had to transfer to Jack Kynock's plane, which was considered a spare. We managed to get in the air. We knew we could be too late. After the first strike, the air defense system would be on alert and we'd be in trouble. For sweetness' sake, it turned out that Jack's plane had very tight controls. I could barely move the ailerons. When we reached the Danish coast, we set a course for Aalborg. Suddenly we were flying over some ships. It couldn't be. We were flying over land. Where were we? Jack didn't know, and I didn't know any more. "When will we be over the target, Jackie?" "In about 5 minutes." "Okay, let's take a better look around." We found ourselves flying over water. I don't know how it happened. Either we were off course or a strong headwind had delayed us. We crawled stubbornly forward, hoping for the unknown. Suddenly a bright dawn broke in the north, and then the sun appeared in all its splendor. Now we could distinguish that we were flying. Above the ground, villages and farms glimmered below. We saw everything we wanted to see and perfectly calmly Jackie say, "Well, look at that guy. I think Copenhagen is on the left." "Damn it, you're right. It is Copenhagen," I shouted. We spun down and laid a wide turn, turning for home. "We've hit a few miles. How soon will we be over the sea again?" Jack did a quick calculation. "In about an hour, if everything goes smoothly." Well, we're caught. All thoughts of bombing Aalborg instantly went out of my mind. We were to fly about 200 miles over enemy territory in bright daylight, alone. Those guys in Norway even altogether didn't stand much of a chance. What about us? Several farmers warmly welcomed our plane, waving their hands in the air. But not everyone was happy to see us. One policeman had the opposite feeling. I saw him pull out a revolver and aim it at us. I think he missed. At that time, we had orders not to fire at anything in occupied territory to avoid civilian casualties, so we didn't do anything to him. We were flying at a very low altitude and saw our shadow dancing across the fields. But God decided to delay our death a little. The fog lifted and we were saved. And just a few minutes ago, I was seriously fearing for my life. I've never been so relieved. Over the sea, we spotted a Heinkel, but it had too little speed to intercept us. I think he was returning from a patrol flight. 4 hours later, we were circling over the airfield at Lossiemouth. Oscar had landed 2 hours before. His attack was successful. But Rossi was less fortunate. The anti-aircraft gunners had time to prepare and greeted him warmly, so he hastily dropped his bombs from 800 feet and took off in a riddled airplane. I accomplished nothing at all and was angry with myself and the world. However, when it turned out that the plane's compass was lying by as much as 20 degrees, I calmed down. That's why we were off course. It wasn't Jack's fault. I went to him and told him I apologized for yelling at him. Everyone was happy. After we got back to Scampton, I asked Chief I to look into the control system. It turned out that one of the self-retracting tanks had burst and the steering rods were rubbing against it. Jack Kynock didn't notice it, but I didn't have his strength, and I had a hard time. Afterward, the pilots laughed a lot at my adventures, especially because after a successful sortie to Middelfart, we missed ungodly. Air Vice Marshal Harris, who met us in the mess hall, also laughed heartily. I tried to tell him about the faulty compass, but Harris remarked that a bad dancer always gets in the way of something. That was the end of it. The next night we flew out to Oslofjord to put mines there. The flight went smoothly for me, but Joe Collier managed to drop his vegetables a few yards off the side of the battleship and said he didn't like it too much. Major Good, an Australian, was wounded in the face and hands by shrapnel from a shell that exploded almost right in the cockpit. But he was lucky. The navigator managed to pull him from the pilot's seat and sat at the wheel himself. They managed to do this difficult operation at an altitude of only 50 feet, at night in the glare of enemy searchlights. Poor old Crappy Kitson had problems of his own. His pilot, Swenson, a native of New Zealand, had flown right over the battleship and had gotten his arse handed to him. Crappy was shot in the face and lost both eyes. I felt just awful when I heard about it. The worst thing is to lose your eyesight. All in all, we received a pretty warm welcome. Several other airplanes were damaged. 3 cars didn't come back at all. Johnny Johnston crashed already in England on the way back. The whole crew was killed. Poor old Johnny was married. I knew his wife very well. She came to collect his things the next day, and it was just pitiful to look at her. The wives of the pilots who lived near the airfield were under constant stress. They spent the whole day in tense anticipation, and deep in their hearts, they knew that one day black news would come to them. Much could be written about these courageous women, and I hope one day to do so. By the end of April, it was clear that everything was over in Norway. We began evacuating troops from Trondheim. It was impossible to get supplies into Norway under constant bombing. First our soldiers retreated, and now they were forced to evacuate altogether. Poor things. I felt sorry for them. They had fought in all the wars and won all the wars. You can have an air force. You can have a navy. But only infantry can take enemy territory, and only infantry can get away with losing men and losing honour. In early May, we conducted another sortie to lay mines. This time the target was Copenhagen, and Snythe said snidely that Gibbo knows it well. Jackie outdid himself this time, and the whole flight took only 6.5 hours. We returned at dawn. No one felt tired, so we uncorked a bottle of beer to celebrate our success. But that's when Oscar walked in. Everyone's gone back, except Pitcairn. Nobody hurt anything. Old Pitcairn was beloved in the squadron. We sat down in a circle and waited for news. An hour went by, another hour went by. Then the muffled sound of an airplane engine came from the east. The airplane was pulling with great difficulty. It was the Hampton. A black dot appeared on the horizon, growing agonizingly slow. We saw that the airplane was flying with the landing gear released, and we could read the letters on its side. B.O. Indeed, it was Pete. Well, thank goodness, Oscar said. Now we can get down to scrambled eggs and bacon. Pete later told his story. When he arrived at Copenhagen, he found he couldn't open the bomb hatch. He tried every method and finally made a mistake. He pulled the emergency landing gear release handle. The cylinder exploded and damaged all the hydraulic systems, and on top of that, it also released the landing gear. It was only then that Pitcairn realized what he'd done. He should have gotten out as soon as possible. Dawn was breaking over Copenhagen. Pete couldn't move the landing gear, he couldn't open the bomb hatch, and the mines were still in the plane. So Pitcairn turned for home and flew on, somehow holding 120 m. He managed to cross Denmark in broad daylight. Many crowds saw him, but they were fooled by the released wheels. They thought it was their own airplane about to land and waved at it. The flight across the sea took 5 hours, but poor old Pete didn't find it all funny. Osby was a funny guy. He'd been my messenger for 2 years, and he'd never been wrong about anything. He never got angry, even when I took the liberty of scolding him. He was quite tall, but some obscure defect caused him to keep his head slightly tilted to one side. He had been born and bred in Lincolnshire, and was completely devoid of a sense of humour. Even after the war broke out, he never changed his habit of telling me the news over a cup of morning tea. So at 9 a.m. on May 10, when his voice woke me up, I was not surprised to hear that Germany had invaded Holland. Without getting out of bed, I reached out and turned on the radio to hear more about all this. Our troops had launched an offensive to save Belgium. The Maginot Line was and remains impregnable. German tanks were driving themselves. However, a military commentator carelessly remarked that no matter how far a tank travelled, sooner or later it would run out of fuel. And besides, tanks that have broken through can be cut off from the main forces and easily destroyed. He assured the audience that there is no cause for concern, although the enemy has cut into our lines. This is perfectly normal in war, and both sides are at serious risk. This news immediately brought everyone to their feet. No one knew what to believe and what not to believe. The unbridled optimism of the Norwegian campaign was too fresh in our minds, and so we prepared for the worst. All dismissals were cancelled, and the squadron was brought to half-hour readiness. But it was another 3 days before anything really happened. Some of our guys were sent to attack Hitler's oil storage tanks, which were far behind the front lines. I, along with other pilots, was to participate in a special operation in the Kiel Canal area. We were sitting in the pre-flight briefing room when we were told of a plan of great importance. If we fully completed the mission, we could paralyze enemy shipping. We were also given the unpleasant news that there were barrage balloons every 300 meters along the canal, and all the bridges were covered by a multitude of anti-aircraft guns and machine guns. Apparently the canal was a difficult target. Oscar, Joe, Pete and I smoked for a long time. Suddenly Oscar started writing something on a cigarette packet. It didn't take long and he handed the packet to Harris, the squadron adjutant. He was a rather old grey-haired man and had fought in the last war. Oscar said quietly, "I want you to read this in the mess hall if I don't go back. You will do that, won't you?" An uncomfortable silence hung. I put out my cigarette, and we walked out into the night. The journey had been difficult. None of us made it to the target, and we all brought the bombs back. The weather was just awful. Low clouds were literally clinging to the tops of the hills, and it was unthinkable to locate the channel in this solid shroud. The next day Pete and I volunteered to fly there again, and this time we were lucky. The weather had improved. The flight was fairly easy, and we did everything that was required of us. However, in those days air reconnaissance was very poor, and we would not know the results of the attack until after the war. But in any case we were proud of ourselves. The whole of a link went to Nottingham to celebrate in the Black Boy Bar. Meanwhile, the battle in France was taking an increasingly unfavourable turn. German troops were rapidly overrunning Holland. Parachutists disguised as nuns and peasants seized important installations. The Germans invaded deep into France. German panzer troops had outflanked the defences and were now simply piling them up like a shepherd gathers his flock. They struck in the Ardennes forest and drove the French back from Metz and the fortress of Sedan, which quickly fell under the blows of dive bombers. Their planes completely dominated the battlefield. We were told that the French General Staff had asked the British to send fighters, but we decided to keep our Metropolitan Air Force intact. It later turned out that this was a wise decision. The crews of the bomber squadrons based in England bitterly watched the unfortunate battles in Blenheim, transferred to France. We saw them shot down one after another, despite the personal courage and training of the pilots. For the attack on the bridge near Maastricht, a young pilot, Fate Battle Garland, was awarded the Victoria Cross. It was a very brave attack, although the pilot lost his life in the process. However, his soul must have shuddered to see how select German sappers built a pontoon bridge in just a few hours to replace the destroyed one. No one even thought of sending us to France. It seems our headquarters realized that our aviation is simply too weak. So we continued to fly at night, using the darkness as a defense against fighters. We used our training to drop bombs as accurately as possible. Such actions seemed wrong to the cabinet strategists, but further events completely justified them. It was a difficult time. We learned hard, but we learned everything. When the Dutch commander-in-chief ordered his army to lay down their arms and surrender to the Germans, the fighting in the Metz area was still going on. The enemy continued to move south, and so the pilots had a lot of work. Our squadrons of the Fighter Command were in a very difficult situation, but showed themselves with the best side. Especially famous were the 1st and 73rd Squadrons, which shot down 4 German planes for every one of their own lost. Anson's and Hudson's of Coastal Command hunted German submarines in the North Sea. Bomber Command planes conducted the first major raids on German territory. Their targets were the oil storage tanks in the port of Hamburg. None of us, who sat around the receiver and listened to the bulletin, had no idea that 3 years later this city would be destroyed by the same weapon, our bombs. Then Snipes spoke. Our targets are located on the west side of the oil depot, map square A3. Planes are to each take 4 500-pound bombs, instant fuses. The tanks must be fully refueled. You must attack from as high as you can see the target. Since the moon is in the south, it is better to attack from the northeast, because you will be able to see the reflection of the docks in the water. I must warn you again that you should try to avoid hitting residential buildings. This night you can only attack a designated target. If you can't find it, come back with bombs. That's it. You can fly to the target by any route you choose and bomb any time between 12 a.m. and 4 a.m. Any questions? The answer was silence, and then Snaith continued. The navigator has prepared the maps, so you may choose your own route. He was silent for a few seconds. I suppose he really wanted to fly himself, but at the time the number of wing commander sorties was severely limited, so he just grinned wryly and wished us luck. The base commander came in, and all the pilots jumped up. He ordered us to land, and then told us how we intend to rectify the situation in France, destroying Hitler's fuel supplies. There was no doubt that during the offensive in Belgium, the Germans spent huge amounts of precious fuel. By destroying his reserves, concentrated in the rear, we must directly affect the course of front operations. That was the plan. Since Jackie and I were going to go to a movie in Lincoln tonight, we decided to take off a little later. We intended to strike between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. We assumed that at that time the light would be at its best. The dawn in the north and the light of the moon would make it easy to spot targets. For a long time, Jackie and I preferred dive bombing. The procedure was as follows. The plane would dive at a 60-degree angle from 6,000 feet to 2,000 feet. We found that we could achieve high bombing accuracy in this way. We also hoped that we could evade anti-aircraft guns and searchlights. The only concern was the speed the airplane would gain at the end of the dive. The glazing of the nose of the old Hampton could not withstand, which would create difficulties for the bombardier. The girls in the army tape was just awful. Neither Jack nor I got any enjoyment out of it. When we got back to the airfield, it turned out that most of the guys had already flown out. They obviously had some plans of their own for the night. The night was pretty clear. We had already been in the air for 2 hours when Jack's voice broke through the deafening noise of the Pegasus engines. What altitude are we at now? About 8,000 feet. There's not much oxygen up here, and I didn't bring my mask. Neither did I, McCuttin. Me too, added Rear Gunner Watty, who was making his first flight with us. Senior Lieutenant Watson was our new weapons officer and had recently arrived at the squadron, having volunteered to fly. He wasn't very sociable, but he transformed when the enemy appeared, and he turned out to be a nice guy in general. It's okay, guys. We're not the masked type. I agreed with them. We were all proud of our crew, and the fact that the pilots of the A Squadron were always considered the kings of the squadron in bombing from low altitudes. At that time, all bomber squadrons had crews who willingly risked their heads by attacking targets from an altitude at which it was impossible to miss. But there were also more than enough who dropped bombs, keeping high in the sky, on targets they thought they saw. Needless to say, there was a fierce rivalry between these men, both sides arguing their point of view. However, it came down to the fact that those attacking from low altitude would pay for it, and those bombing from high altitude would be able to conduct another raid. The facts, however, did not bear this out too well. To succeed, a bomber pilot must have remarkable skill and courage, but to do his job, one still had to stay alive. That didn't necessarily mean staying high, assuming you were safe and dreaming of scrambled eggs and bacon when you got back. It didn't necessarily mean needlessly risking the lives of the crew. It just meant putting bombs on target in the easiest way possible. That's what we thought at the time, and our point of view hasn't changed too much since then. And then we saw Hamburg for the first time, and then we discovered that the moon was not where it should be. It was just a little red circle on the very horizon. As we flew closer, we saw the docks. Then we discerned the city, a big dark hulk stretching for miles in all directions. On its northern edge, we saw an oil storage tank burning. Although only one tank was burning, the glow of the flames were flickering around, giving an exaggerated impression of the strength of the fire. This is probably why many crews reported the destruction of the target, but German radio reported that the raid did not cause any damage. During a night raid, it is very difficult to determine the results of a bombing raid. It was only when a reconnaissance plane took photographs during the day that we were able to find out exactly what we had accomplished. But in any case, it seemed to us that the oil storage facility was on fire, and the bombardier even shrieked with joy. The beams of many searchlights nervously scanned the sky, many anti-aircraft guns fired indiscriminately, and something like a colourful umbrella appeared over the docks. We desynchronized the engines to make it harder for the noise detectors to work. But this only caused the plane to shake violently. There turned out to be a lot more anti-aircraft guns than I had ever seen in my life. Watching them fire is very satisfying. A glowing arc of light rises into the air, coming closer and closer. Then it whistles loudly past the cabin and explodes about 100 yards behind. It makes a very funny sound, something like poke, poke, poke. Each shell leaves a coloured trail, and they usually follow each other in strict order: green, white, red. It feels like an illuminated fountain taking off into the sky. Yes, it's nice to look at it and feel safe, but if the projectile hits the target, there is a kind of thunderclap, the scraping of metal and the clinking of broken glass. Everything around you turns red as your tanks burst into flames, and your insides freeze as the airplane starts to go down. You try to get out, but the airflow won't let you in. You yell at the crew members to jump out, and all the while the anti-aircraft guns keep pouring fire on your plane, and then you hit the ground, and it's over. Up goes the hot gasoline flames, and your soul takes to the heavens with the speed of a rocket. All these pictures instantly fly through your imagination as the coloured arc of the tracer curves close to the plane, and you frantically tear the handle to dodge away. But poor old Robbo from B Squadron couldn't dodge. The last time I saw him, the plane was hurtling toward the ground like a flaming comet, and once you're on a combat course, you've got to hold it, despite any anti-aircraft fire. Finally, we were about a mile northeast of the oil tank farm at about 6,000 feet. Down below, I saw Peter Wardhunt of 49 Squadron holding at 2,000 feet. All hell was raging around him, but he was okay for now. At the same time, several guys were circling at 15,000 feet, between the occasional bursts of heavy shells. Suddenly, right below the left engine tail, I could clearly see the oil storage tanks. Yes, only one tank was burning. The others looked like silver golf balls in the moonlight. Then I put the airplane on the left wing and we went into a dive. The nose of the airplane pecked down, and the altimeter arrow spun frantically to 0. But the speed indicator soared to unheard of heights. Jack sat in the forward cockpit in the bombardier's seat, waiting for the order to drop the bombs. I watched the golf balls grow larger and larger, gradually covering the cockpit windshield. Watty had to see to it that the bomb hatch flaps opened, and Mac, sitting at the overhead machine gun, kept an eye on the air. At last the moment came. "Drop the bombs," I shouted to Jack. Bombs dropped. A little later I asked, "Watty, did you see anything?" "Nothing. I don't think they're out." "They should." "No, they stayed. I can see them," Jack interjected. When I finished cursing at the screwed-up electricians, we started to gain altitude again. With the bombs on board, it wasn't easy, but we had no choice as it was getting light fast. Our engines were red hot, but we still climbed to 5,000 feet. But now we could not see the oil tanks, as the smoke of the fire had completely obscured not only them, but all the docks in general. As we circled over the harbour, dodging searchlights and anti-aircraft guns, I noticed several balloons bobbing gently just above, a rather unpleasant discovery. Suddenly to my right, I saw the coveted tanks and immediately spiked straight for them. Since the dive was almost vertical, we reached a phenomenal speed of 320 mph. The airplane became almost uncontrollable, although I had both feet on the dashboard and was pulling the handle with all my might. I managed to straighten out only with the help of trimmers on the tailplane. For a moment we lost consciousness from the terrible overload. This time our bombs hit the target, and something behind us began to burn and explode. Since we were diving too dashingly, we found ourselves right in hell. 2,000 feet above the center of Hamburg is not a very safe altitude. Anti-aircraft shells whistled around us, and every now and then there was a horrible poke, poke, poke. Then several broad searchlight beams stabbed right into the airplane, and we were practically blinded. Duck was saying turn right, turn left, but I knew he couldn't see anything. I ducked right into the searchlight and fired my course machine gun. I think I yelled wild, "Take that, motherfucker!" The searchlight went out, and I thought with bloodthirsty joy that it would be a good idea to kill the operator. I quickly glanced to my right and saw that our right wing was on fire. That was the end of it. The best thing to do right now would be to jump out with the parachutes. So I pressed the emergency abandon aircraft button. However, it didn't work. I took another look at the wing and swore. It was not fire, but a bent piece of metal that shone brightly in the beam of the searchlight. Then I said to Jack, "I think we've been hit. That's funny. You'll laugh even more when you find out we've got a couple 100 feet of balloon cable wrapped around the wing," he replied. Of course, Jack had exaggerated a bit. But we had indeed snagged the cable, and the strange behavior of the plane was attributed to damage from anti-aircraft fire. Finally, we got out, exchanged a few pleasantries with the air defense ships on the roadstead, and safely reached home shores. It was very nice to see the English scenery under the wing. Someone was already talking about scrambled eggs and bacon in half an hour. Sunny Scampton was just a wonderful place to be. Everyone was very happy and tried their best. The base commander, however, had one little quirk. He hated the airfield lights. He simply hated them because he had to secure the airfield from enemy bombardment, and the lights gave him away with his head. So instead of a chain of lights along the entire landing strip, the returning bombers saw only a couple of dim red lights. So every landing was a serious challenge. But this morning it was foggy, and we couldn't see anything at all, not even hangars. So we had to turn to Abingdon, where we landed safely, cursing the base commander and his drive lights. We were as hungry as wolves, especially as the anticipated bacon and eggs had faded away. Many planes were damaged during this raid, and several were wounded. But the operation was the first of its kind for us, and it ended successfully. Most of the planes went on target at low altitude in the best traditions of the Royal Air Force. On the other hand, one major bombed from 16,000 feet. His bombs caused a fire that helped us find the target. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Thus ended a typical early 1940 raid on German territory. I have described it in such detail to show how much the nature of operations changed later. The first raids were planned in a completely futile way. We could choose the route. We could bomb from any altitude and any time. Sometimes we could even choose which bombs to use. We were hardened individualists, but to tell you the truth, our actions were not very effective. Apparently, of the total number of bombs carried that night by the A-planes, no more than 10% hit the target. A few days later, we visited the same place again, but the clouds were too low. The lower limit of cloud cover was only 500 feet. It was simply unsafe to drop bombs from that height. Oscar was the only one who ventured out, and his gunner reported that one tank flew into the air above the plane. I believe poor Dennis Field tried to do the same thing, however, he did not return. He was a remarkable man. The next day I was talking in our dining room with his wife, Joan. She was packing up his things to take home. I remember that she didn't immediately find his movie camera, which turned up in his flight suit locker in the B Squadron lounge. Joan was a brave woman, but everyone was like that at that time. For the next few days we didn't fly. First of all because the weather was nasty, but other than that, it just wasn't necessary. The situation in Belgium and France continued to deteriorate. But in England, the constant fogs closed the airfields, so God's will prevented us from taking part in the fighting. But the Krauts at this time began to conduct raids on English territory, although still small forces. A group of 12 Do-17 bombers crossed the Yorkshire coast near Whitnessea and attacked the large airbase at Morpeth. It was a fine airfield reminiscent of Scampton, but the Dorniers did their job perfectly. They bombed all 4 hangars and destroyed all the major buildings, including the officers' mess hall, workshops and kitchen. Only the sergeant's mess hall survived. Either the Germans missed or they simply ran out of bombs. The Germans may have been pleased with the results. They probably were. However, they knew that our fighters were fighting hard in the south of England, but now our fighters were on the alert. Although the unfortunate building had been damaged, not a single Dornier returned to base to report it. All of them were shot down over the sea. Our trawlers picked up several German pilots who asked only one question. "Where did your fighters come from?" "We thought they were in France." The break in flying we tried to make the best use of and went to Lincoln. In this town we found a pub with some pretensions to sophistication. In this den, nicknamed Snake Pete's, young maidens were entrenched, grooming foolish young officers. They would literally hang around their necks, begging for a treat. We called them love priestesses, but only a few of us risked dealing with them. We were all in good health and we weren't going to risk it. One officer, whose name I will not mention, behaved a little differently. He left our company and invited a slender blonde to have a beer. They started talking sweetly about something, but soon we noticed that their conversation was going sideways. And then came the explosion. "Give me back my damn beer." He yelled and ran back toward us, holding his can and her half-drunk mug. She jumped up too and started swearing at the entire bar. "Something wrong?" one of us inquired. "She didn't want to pay," declared young Romeo, hurriedly finishing both beers. Oscar muttered. Geez, you're a chump. Come on, Gibbo, let's go to George's. We can sit there for a couple hours. The evening was very dark, and the moon had not yet risen. Travelling by automobile with darkened headlights was a matter of no nonsense, as I had previously experienced. This time I saw two thin white lines that disappeared as soon as I blinked. A very disturbing and dangerous situation. Eventually I peeled off the camouflage shields and we rushed toward George at a dangerous speed. The guys in the back seat were singing songs. A policeman bored on the side of the road must have been astonished to see a car with its headlights on fire, its occupants yelling something in drunken voices. He immediately called the next police post. I still tried to carefully keep to the left side without crossing the centre line. Oscar was yelling right in my ear. Faster, faster. Suddenly, a red light appeared right in front of my hood in the middle of the road, slowly swaying from side to side. The car no longer had time to slow down or turn. I realized that. I was drunk out of my mind. I knew that too. I wasn't thinking straight, and everyone knew it, so I just stepped on the gas. How we didn't kill the officer of the law is still a mystery. All I remember is that the flashlight went one way and my feet flashed the other. After we had driven quite a distance away, I turned off the headlights and drove down a country lane. The guys were well aware of what we had done and didn't say a word. We struggled to catch our breath, like a submarine sneaking into Hamburg harbour. Then we waited about 15 minutes. One by one, the pilots went straight across the field to George. A little later, a few more of our guys showed up, and when we touched down, the noise picked up again. And the next evening, I had the pleasure of supplying a drink to a country policeman who told me that he had nearly been run over to death by a drunken farmer returning from a fair in Lincoln. Although we did not make any sorties for 3 or 4 nights, we did not loiter during the day. Jackie, Dickie Bunker, and Bill Tweedale got their own crews to fill in the gaps caused by the losses. This meant that I was left without a navigator. However, my gunner, Watty, claimed to have learned something during the past year, so I decided to give him a little test by flying an outbound flight in an old Anson. He had quickly mastered the art of map reading and learned the basics of piloting pretty quickly, so I could count on him in a pinch. In all, we spent about 15 hours in the air over the 2 days, which was not easy at all, especially for Watty, who was over 30. He had already missed the best time to study. On the last day of our forced vacation, I called Eva and asked her to come over to introduce her to my guys, if there were no flights that night. But, as usual in such cases, things went south. The night she arrived, I had been sent out to play whack-a-mole with, and it was up to my friend Ian to meet her. Together they watched me take to the evening sky in an old airplane and went out to dinner. For the next few nights we shuttled between Dusseldorf and George, Mannerheim and Petewood, Kiel and Lincoln. But you can't burn the candle at both ends. I didn't manage that either. By the end of the month I was so exhausted that Willie Snithe gave me a week's vacation. The day before I left I was met by Harris, the squadron adjutant, and told that I had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Oscar, Rosie, Bill and Dickie had also received this award. This was good news that we had admittedly been waiting for a long time. There were smiles all around. I immediately called Eve and invited her to Snake Pete's. That's where all the guys were going to be. It was a nightmare. The party was amazing, but the next day was much less pleasant. At about 9:00 a.m. Bruce called me and said, "Good news for our guys." "What guys?" I asked, still not fully awake. "The Oscar and Company. They got the Distinguished Flying Crosses." I almost queried myself, but decided to look at the papers instead. Yes, he turned out to be right. Everyone got awards, except me. I went to Brighton with Eva, extremely disappointed. I'd had such a great time last night, and it had been a waste.